Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative in my presentation to you this afternoon to spice up some discussion for later in the session. And my presentation is really about lifting the vision, because if we've got an environment where we can no longer rely on growth through traditional population growth, then how can we achieve the levels of prosperity to which we all aspire without us all working into our dotage, which is kind of the scenario that we might face unless we can find other ways of delivering. And in my context, obviously, I'm talking about infrastructure, and I'm looking at this problem through the lens of, or this opportunity really, through the lens of infrastructure. Just so that you know who NZCID is, because many of you may not, we are a thought leadership infrastructure peak body, and our membership is up on the screen, and we exist to really stimulate discussion around how New Zealand's infrastructure can be fit for purpose. Where are the issues, the challenges that we must face so that we have the core infrastructure that will enable a strong and growing and prosperous nation. Just in terms of outline of my presentation today, like other presenters, I'm going to start globally, just looking at some international trends in terms of what's happening in infrastructure. And then I'm going to bring that into the context of the Bay of Plenty. And I want to talk about vision. I want to talk about what's happening in terms of spatial planning globally and what potential opportunities there might be. I'm going to emphasise the importance of scale. Now, bear in mind I'm talking through an infrastructure lens, and so scale becomes very important when you're talking infrastructure. And then I'm going to pose you some questions and challenges, and even post an idea about governance for you to have some discussion on. Why does this matter? Well, it actually matters quite a lot. Why is infrastructure important? There's a plot on the screen there which shows you the relationship, and this is the World Economic Forum graph, the relationship between infrastructure quality and overall performance in terms of economic terms. And you can see there's a pretty strong correlation there between the two, and right at the very peak of being strong in both terms of infrastructure delivery and economic outcome is Switzerland. Just to put in context of where New Zealand sits on this particular chart, hopefully it's going to come up in a second, there we go. So actually we're in the top 20 overall for our economic output in the productivity scale in the World Economic Forum. But relative to some other nations we might compare ourselves with, we've got some wee way to go. And actually much of our infrastructure, particularly our ports, our airports, is of good quality. Where we really struggle in terms of the quality of our infrastructure, and it is very apparent in this region, is the quality or lack of quality of our transport networks and our connectivity between our cities and our regions. So let's have a look at some international trends of what's happening. And what you see when you look globally at thinking of infrastructure and investment is very strong focus on national and regional spatial thinking. So thinking has gone away from thinking in small, low-level aspects of investment to how does this all work together as a whole, as a system? How are we developing our area, our region, our space most effectively? And that spatial planning is all about driving improved productivity to enable development and get better value for money. These are the core drivers. There's also a very strong shift, and we saw it in the presentations coming through this morning, about the importance of cities. And so governments and planners are thinking very seriously about how we develop our cities to the best advantage. And we're starting to see very strong national leadership in city and urban development. The other very strong trend is the important partnership between central local government and the private sector. So no longer these discussions about the us and them and pointing fingers at one another, you're not doing what we need to achieve our outcomes. The focus is much more about how can we work together to achieve those outcomes. And that's because there's a need to strengthen the capacity to manage complex change, and the world is definitely getting more complex. The other trend is a very consistent and strong trend towards advanced planning and design and funding. New innovative ideas about how you invest and deliver infrastructure, how you get a synergy between urban growth and development and investment. And the slides there will list some of the details of that. There is also a very strong trend towards consolidation because scale does matter, and I'm going to show you some slides shortly that emphasise that a little bit more. Empirical research, certainly from an intensive infrastructure perspective, clearly demonstrate that scale matters. But it's in other areas of local government where scale is a difficulty, a challenge, in areas like local participation democracy. So the challenge before us is how do we get the best world of local participation and democracy and input, and the community having the opportunity for their voice, which is one of the key aspects of local government, on the one hand, versus how do we deliver scale on the other. And that'll be the theme of my presentation as I go through. But I want to give you some examples from some other nations that we might think are, similar to us in some ways. Scotland, much of our heritage comes from there. In a recent trip to Scotland, what you see is a very strong national leadership in spatial planning, a desire to make sure there's a very strong link from Edinburgh to Glasgow in the central corridor. They're talking about national designations of a significant infrastructure to make sure that the right investment is happening in the right place at the right time. So none of this argy-bargy of local government arguing with central government about where the priorities for investment are. Actually, the purpose of spatial planning is to have this conversation about agreement on where the investment should be and what the priority should be. The Irish National Development Plan goes way back to 2007, and it is the end of its transition this year, or of its completion this year. It was a €184 billion investment, largely most significantly in transport connections. And the theme of that was how do we connect the growing and wealthy Dublin, pre-GFC obviously we're talking about, how do we connect that to the less prosperous part of Ireland? And the way they did it was through significant investment in road and rail investment to the 5 or 7 provincial cities and towns to the west of Ireland. So very strong central as well as local government leadership and coalition to drive national development. Denmark is another exemplar, and I guess they're probably the exemplar of really lifting vision. Small country, 5 million people, small in area, uniquely located but actually divided by sea to the rest of Europe. So what was their solution? Let's not think about our constraints and the fact that we can't get that connectivity. Let's create that connectivity. So they've built these massive bridges, and you can see the illustrations of them. One's a combination bridge tunnel, so they actually built an island in the middle of the sea between Denmark and Sweden, so they could put the portal for the tunnel so they could still get the ships through the channel. Now this is big thinking. They didn't have the money for that investment, so they figured out how were they going to get the money. The only way they were going to be able to get it was to charge users a toll to use that facility. It cost you roughly the equivalent of 60 New Zealand dollars to use each one of those bridges. But boy, did it open up the opportunity for Denmark to be the bridge, literally, from Sweden, Finland to the rest of Western Europe. So suddenly huge economic growth occurred as a result of that connectivity. Suddenly people in Denmark were holidaying in South Sweden. Previously they had to catch a tortuous ferry ride across, and vice versa, people in Sweden, southern Sweden, were now becoming the workforce of an ageing population in Denmark. Innovative thinking. They weren't constrained by their current box thinking, I guess. Similar trend in the UK, where instead of the sort of traditional approach that we would take in New Zealand, how much money we got and how can we fit our investment according to our purse, there is a shift in thinking about, well, what is the investment we need to grow our economy? What is our vision of what we want to achieve? What are the outcomes that we want? What's the portfolio of investment that's necessary to enable that outcome? And then how can we ensure that our planning, legislation and funding policies deliver those outcomes? So now I come to the question of the Bay of Plenty. What is the vision, leadership and implementation capacity of the Bay of Plenty region to achieve that level of prosperity? What's the spatial and economic plan for the region? Is there one? I've seen sub-regional plans. I've seen strong cooperation and collaboration and smart growth and those sorts of development. Fantastic. But how do you elevate that level of cooperation region-wide to really make this region tick? Who should lead it, and how should it be led? And will they have the capability to deliver? Will they have decision-making authority, or will they always have to go back to their individual shareholders to get cooperation and collaboration? Will they have the financial strength, the commercial expertise and the marketing expertise to be able to deliver? Because that is what's going to be enable the growth opportunities, the prosperity building opportunities for the region. And a key challenge for us, the map shows where the current regional boundaries are in the shaded area. Why are they there? They were drawn back in 1989. What was the logic? It was based on a water catchment, as I understand. Is that still relevant today? Is there a better affinity between the Waikato and the Bay of Plenty? Should the Bay of Plenty include Thames Coromandel? Should Rotorua, Taupo, the Central Plateau be a region? Should the Western Bay be a region by itself? Is it east and west? But where do you draw your lines and why? And the answer surely has to come around what is the best opportunity for the people within our area. I now want to turn to the issue of scale, because scale does matter. Just to give you an example, Scottish Water was formed back in 2002, and it, at the time was many duplicative, very small water supply units across Scotland. I think it was 400 in total, certainly a large number. They achieved scale by rationalising down to 3, and now they're down to 1 water provider for the entire area of Scotland. It's a publicly owned organisation. It has a separate regulator. And in that time, they've achieved operating costs reductions of 40%. And how did they do that? They use technology. They use smart thinking. They have remote monitoring of the performance of their water system so that they can have very timely interventions. They know when deterioration of their pipes is occurring, and they're dealing with it through smart use of technology and a single job dispatch system for the entire network. Recently, NZCID partnered with Water New Zealand and a number of Treasury and a number of other organisations to conduct a pilot water study in the Waikato region. And a number of the Waikato local authorities participated in this, and it was a question of, let's have a look at ourselves as how well we're providing the water services within our areas, because we want continuous improvement, and good on them for acknowledging that opportunity. What the conclusions did show was that scale does matter, and it matters because you can achieve greater strategic focus on the provision of that core service. In this case, it's water. You can bring in the best specialisation and expertise to make sure that you can deliver the service standards that you're looking at, including the technical staff that's required. You can clearly achieve purchasing powers and economies through that. One of the most important factors in this is strategic focus, is the ability to be very singular-minded in terms of delivering service to your customers. The other very strong message that came through is direct pricing, i.e. demand pricing or volumetric pricing for water, provides a direct revenue stream to which you can then use to reinvest for the future, rather than relying on political decision-making processes that change on triennial cycles of elections. Watercare since amalgamation also provides some examples. The next 2 slides I'm not going to go through, but it gives you some data to have a look back on later. But the significant number there is that since amalgamation, and we are only talking a couple of years here, $104 million has been achieved in savings. And the prices that were previously projected by the previous city councils in terms of what their expected water prices were going to be have been significantly reduced on what they otherwise would have been. The wastewater price increased by 4.5%, but it otherwise was planned to increase by close to 36%. 36%. So from that point of view, significant improvements, even just from a financial point of view, are possible. But there have also been improvements in terms of customer service, the level of investment in infrastructure, their financing, and their ability to accommodate all of the previous operations of the individual water companies. On the other hand, when you look at the statistics nationally, small councils struggle to meet standards. This particular graph shows you the compliance with New Zealand drinking water standards. Pleasingly, most large councils do manage to achieve good standards. But there are very many councils with populations up to 10,000 people who are only 50% of standard. Now that has to be a concern. Many would argue, and I've heard this argument, that the water standards are too high. Well, they're based on international health standards for drinking water quality. And is there a reason or justification for rural communities to have lower quality water and health problems associated with that than urban communities? What's the social equity of that? Similarly, from an environmental point of view, if you look at the compliance, there's a standard Ministry for the Environment report on compliance with statute, the RMA. And we see very, very low standards of compliance in terms of environmental reporting and monitoring. And these are issues about the lack of scale of the councils to be able to sustain the level of monitoring that is required. Now you may say, oh, it doesn't matter. But New Zealand prides itself on a high quality environment. We are trading off some of our aspirations as a nation just simply because we don't have the capacity. Is that the smartest thing to be doing? This is a complicated graph, and I'll leave it for you to have a look at in the presentations later. But you'll notice there's a whole lot of lines on the graph, and they all sort of peak and then they fall away. And the purpose of the lines, and this was a piece of work that was done by the Road Maintenance Task Force, and it's a theoretical, this is not an analytical, this hasn't been backed by data. But they asked themselves the question conceptually, and we had all of the experts, if you like, around the table in terms of roading provision. What's the optimum scale? Should we have one roading agency for the entire country? Should we have maybe one in the North Island and one in the South Island? Or are we better at the other end of the scale to have small roading authorities? Or is there some happy medium in the middle? And the conclusion of this group was, and they looked at various parameters, which is the lines that you can see there, was that in most things you can achieve economies of scale up to a certain point. But then things get too big, too hard to handle. Communication starts to fail, or the distance between your work or your resources becomes too great, and you start to struggle with diseconomies of scale, which is why the curves go back down. And they've looked at this through the roading lens, and their conclusion was that around the size of a region, as the regions that we have, the regional council areas, is about the sort of optimum size for delivery of road management services. Smaller was too small because you didn't have the right resources capacity. But much larger than that, and you can see the North Island is, the two island model is about where the bottom of each one of those lines bottom out. So that was considered too big, too hard to handle. So some interesting thinking, and the beauty of this graph is it captures the thinking around too small is too small, too big becomes unmanageable. So where is the happy medium? Local Government New Zealand and the Australian Council for Centre for Excellence for Local Government did some work across globally looking at what do we learn from international experience in terms of economies of scale, amalgamations, the benefits, etc. Their conclusion was that from an infrastructure perspective, there is a very strong link between efficiency and economies of scale, strategic capacity, service improvement and innovation, and potential diminution of the first three, a very strong link in terms of efficiency. The downside, efficiency through amalgamation, the downside is clearly the loss of local democracy and identity. So we come back to this challenge. How do we deliver good quality infrastructure on the one hand, which steers us down a scale, and then on the other hand, achieve local community interest and participation and all of those good things that Peter and the other speakers were talking about this morning. I'm going to park that question for a moment and come back to it. One thing is for sure, is that our current legislative planning processes between the Land Transport Management Act, the Resource Management Act, and the Local Government Act do not support one another at all. They are, and these are the three major planning statutes that you as local authorities are working with, They have conflicting objectives, different priorities, complex processes, many of which don't support one another. And it really does beg the question why we have such less than optimum, let's say that, outcomes as a result of the process. The process itself does not lend itself to integrated thinking about how we deliver these things. Perhaps our planning and legislative framework should encourage thinking about spatial development, how we integrate land use and transport investment to make sure that we get those happening in sync with one another, instead of having separate processes as we currently do that encourage division and difficulty. Another complex chart for you to have a pore over when you have the time to come back and have a look at this presentation. But the theme of this slide is a concept of national spatial planning, a la Ireland, Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, those other countries that I illustrated earlier, regional spatial planning, and then the ability to deliver on those through asset management plans. I now want to turn to Auckland. Because NZCID was a strong champion for governance reform in Auckland, and you can probably understand some of the reasons why. We drew this chart, and it became quite a strong influencer for people to understand, or begin to understand, the complexity of what was Auckland. It plots the decision-making processes, the funding processes between not only the parts of Auckland, private sector and local government, but also central government. It was an extremely complex relationship, and you wonder why decisions were slow and cumbersome, and why Auckland was not achieving the optimum that could be achieved. I haven't drawn one for the Bay of Plenty, but I wonder, it wouldn't be that complicated, but I tell you what, it would still be pretty complicated. And you've got to ask yourselves, is this the best way that we can grow the future of our region? Is this the best way that we can actually deliver value to the people that we are supporting? So, here's a concept for you. Some of you will hate this. Some of you will think, actually, this might have some mileage. This is a concept drawn on, and in fact, I've deliberately written over the Auckland plan submission the illustration of what we thought the Auckland Council should look like, and I've put in the Bay of Plenty. I don't know the Bay of Plenty as well as I did know Auckland, so you'll have to forgive me that some of the perhaps groupings of locations and whatnot might not be appropriate, but I put them there for illustrative purposes. And you'll see down at the bottom of my governance chart, the diagram is for illustrative purposes only. It's not what I'm suggesting to you is the solution, at least not yet. So I'm proposing the idea of a single Bay of Plenty council. I'm not quite sure what the boundaries of that council might be. Is it two councils, Eastern Bay and Western Bay? Or is it one bay? Or is it Bay plus Waikato? Now there's a stimulating thought. So don't take this too literally, but let's just assume that it's the existing boundaries for a moment. You would have a single mayor. That mayor would be elected from across the entire Bay of Plenty. He or she may not come from Tauranga. He or she might come from Opotiki, Rotorua, Whakatane. The council would be elected from the entire region. They wouldn't all come from Tauranga, as some of you might suggest. In fact, there'd be a proportionate representation across the region. Their mission as a council is not to promote Rotorua, Opotiki, or Tauranga. Their mission is to make sure that the future development of the region is at the very best. Now that means capitalising, growing and developing the particular strengths of Opotiki, of a Rotorua, of a Mokoroa. Their interest is region-wide. It's a different concept from thinking about Tauranga taking over Rotorua or vice versa. And I've seen some of the media coverage that's come through, and that has been the tenor of the debate. You've got to lift your vision above that sort of conversation. if you really want to achieve the opportunities that this region offers you. Now, there's sort of three strands to this structure that I put together. If you look to the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that we're proposing a number of council-controlled organisations, one for transport, one for water, perhaps one for economic development driving that, one for the urban development opportunities that might present themselves across each of the locations, etc. The number of CCOs would obviously be up for discussion and what their focus might be, but this is for, remember, illustrative purposes only. Why CCOs for water and transport? Well, because you want to have the best minds that you can governing the delivery of your transport and water systems. You want to bring in the best expertise that you can to deliver those services. And frankly, people don't really care who's governing these things, as long as when they turn the water on, it's high quality water that they can trust at a reasonable price. So why not get the very best minds that you can recruit in a CCO structure with a proper governance to deliver that outcome? The council will still set the criteria that those CCOs will have to work to. The CCOs will be publicly owned. They are owned by the council. So it'll be the population of the region that will determine their direction and hold them accountable to their performance and delivery, accountability. I'm now going to take you to the other side of the graph, and it's headed by local boards. In fact, NZCID called them community councils rather than local boards, but I've had to change it to local boards because that's in the legislation. But the concept behind community councils was that they are the people that are looking within their local communities at the things that really make a community tick. How are the community support? How's the education? How's our community being developed? Are our young being nurtured and fostered? Those are the things that really make our community, as well as are our parks what we want them to be? Is the main street what we want it to be? Those are what are making a community. It's not the pipes in the ground. Shouldn't the focus of local government be truly on the community rather than the assets? All the assets are going to do is deliver you a service to the community. All the community wants is that those assets are delivered and managed to the best possible way they can be. So the local boards are all about local democracy. In Auckland, the local boards are working generally very well. I say generally because actually I think more authority could probably be delivered to some of those local boards. And more financing could be delivered to some of those local boards. But I suspect that that will evolve over time. And then in the centre is obviously of my chart is the administrative core of the council, and its purpose in life is to provide support not only to the council and its decision-making processes and its planning processes, but also to the local boards. An idea for you to think on. In any case, regardless of whether or not you go for amalgamation or full amalgamation of your councils when you're thinking about the future of this region, there are very clear opportunities for scale to be achieved through shared services, benchmarking, your comparison performance between your various local authorities, clustering, mentoring, etc. Excuse me. And applying advanced procurement techniques. But the literature tells us that that is very, very hard to sustain over time. Inevitably, councils will change, personalities will change, and as a result of that, budgets will change. And so the ability to commit to shared service arrangements in a consistent long-term way that's enduring become compromised. So for me, I would encourage you to think about the opportunities of amalgamation. Yes, you can make strides through shared services. This region has already demonstrated its capability to do that. But at the end of the day, how sustainable are they over time? That's the question you must ask yourself. In any case, partnership between the public and private sector, including central and local government, is key. We live in a world of capital scarcity. That means we've got to optimise everything that we do. And to continue compromising all of the time is not in the world of optimisation or best value. So, final slide. Unleashing the Bay of Plenty, what would I recommend you think about? First of all, agree between you a spatial plan or a vision about how you want this region to develop. What are the key infrastructure investments that are required to support that investment and how you fund them? You have to agree the phasing and implementation of that regional development and infrastructure and where it goes, and commit the public investment to support that. Then you secure the funding. This is not the other way around. You don't start and say how much money we got and how can we fit the funding to it. Think of what the Danes did. They didn't have the money to build a bridge in their conventional way of thinking about things, so they thought about a different way of solving the problem. In Auckland right now, we have a spatial plan that has a $25 billion price tag to investment to transport that Auckland doesn't have, nor does the government have. And yet everyone, or almost everyone, agrees that those $25 million worth of projects are worthwhile into the future. The question is, how do we fund them? We've been talking about maybe we put tolls on our motorway system in Auckland to raise the necessary funds for future investment. Because there's one thing for sure, unless we choose to do something, nothing's going to happen. So if we really want a future that has a good transport system, yes, we are going to have to dip our hands in our pockets to fund it. But the upside is a region that is fit for purpose and is going to grow into the future. So funding follows your planning. Proactively engage with business and support private investment, because it is that partnership that's going to encourage the growth and enable the prosperity that the growth in dollars I'm talking about rather than the growth in population, to encourage the prosperity that you are looking for the future. Clearly, planning needs to be integrated and streamlined. Having 6 different district plans, go figure, how is that making life easy for investment? And then I think this is my final point, if it comes up. Oh. Can't have been important. No, look, the key message I think is that this region has an opportunity to think about what it does for the future, and it's the result of the government's reforms, like them or not. The power for decision making is in your hands. There are economies of scale that can be achieved in terms of infrastructure, and you can achieve local democracy at the local level. You've just got to get your structure right. I would encourage you to really have and engage in that conversation. Thank you.
Any quick questions for Stephen before he leaves? Over here, please.
Stephen, I wanted to talk. Alan Vickers is my name.
Alan, nice to see you.
Stephen, I wanted to talk to you about the concepts of CCOs for vertically integrated water delivery, and whether you think that sufficient control is provided through statements of intent, or whether you need independent regulators. And having been a director of a water company, there are 4 elements that need to be considered. There's economic regulation, there's the water quality or health side of it, there's environmental regulation, and there is the customer regulation. So the question is, can you rely on the statements of intent as a sufficient control, or do you think that we need to consider some form of national water regulator?
I'm a strong supporter for a national water, and actually NZCID floats the idea of a National Water Commission, which would have oversight over how we optimise the use of our water resources in this country. Actually, if you look at New Zealand at the moment, there is nobody in charge of water. You've got local authorities have a very strong influence. you've got the Department of Health, you've got the Department of Internal Affairs, Ministry for the Environment, I could go on. There are ministries with a direct interest in water, but actually no one is leading that conversation. So what we've done to date is we've had a Land and Water Forum who have finally brought together all of the various stakeholders in water to have a discussion about how best we capitalise on that tremendous resource that New Zealand has. Maybe it's time we had the next step about how we institutionalise that sort of process. And our view is around the idea of a National Water Commission, and its purview will be looking at the performance of local authorities and delivering those customer service standards at a reasonable price in an effective way. So no, I don't think SCIs are enough by themselves, and some independent view will be needed.
Thank you, Stephen. I can smell food in the air. You're probably getting distracted, but there may be another question or two. Over here, please.
Hi, Stephen. Paul Coss, Greater Wellington.
Hey, Paul.
Just the challenge you've identified about dealing with the big picture stuff, but also the local democracy stuff. And I was quite interested in your chart, obviously. In Wellington, we're looking at one of the ideas is the local board model. You identified, you had a sort of, without entirely happy with the local board model in Auckland, perhaps not having enough to do enough finances. Our sort of views were quite similar until we started talking to some of the Auckland people and their suggestions that they had like too many local boards, and that in a sense some of the functions that they had dealing with some of the regional type infrastructure like pools and libraries was actually causing a bit of an issue in terms of dealing with the strategic issues. So I was just wondering if you could maybe tease that aspect out a little bit more.
Yeah, I think this will be an evolving thing in Auckland. No one's ever going to come up with the right solution straight away. I've visited all of the local boards over the last year talking about alternative funding for Auckland Transport. And I've got to say I was really impressed with what I saw as I went round, where there was very strong community engagement by individuals going along and talking to the board about their individual problems. But yes, there are also challenges in that quite a few of the big decisions had actually been delegated down to the local boards, which was creating tensions. So I think that will wax and wane over time. I see the local board's focus should be on those things, and this will need to be determined by communities, but on those things that really make a community tick. And they tend not to be about where you put the pipes in the ground or where the major arterials go. It's whether or not the local sports ground is meeting its need and the kids can turn up and have a game, or whether it's somewhere where the people can come and meet or talk or whatever it might be. And it's whether or not the social and community and all of those connections and those wicked issues, as Peter uses that term, are adequately being addressed. And the best way I can describe it is to be the eyes, ears and voice of the local community, both with the central governing body but also with the government agencies that are working in that community to actually give meaning to that relationship and provide the leadership of those local communities. So that's how I would describe the role of a local board, and less about building roads and digging ditches and all of that sort of stuff.